choices, new players, new models of care. You know consumer first healthcare is everywhere. For us to build the future, to see what's new, we gotta look at the world from a different point of view. Consumer innovation ain't going away. I say it's here to stay. Today it leads the way. We gotta drop the silos. We're all the same team. Experience, business, tech, and marketing. So join us now. Join the revolution. Consumer first health is the evolution. Status quo or like status no. Yeah, this is the healthcare rap. Yo, come on, let's go.
Welcome back to the leading podcast about consumer innovation. I'm Jared Johnson, and here's what's going to go down today. We have the Flava of the week about, of course, Walmart closing all 51 of its healthcare clinics. As we move through our stages of grief, can we take a moment and acknowledge how conversations about consumer health have changed as a result of having Walmart in the healthcare business? And how will health systems respond? I'll talk about that. Then we welcome Will Johnson from Oscar. As Vice President and General Manager of Plus Oscar, Will sees an urgency to prioritize personalization. So we'll dive into how healthcare organizations democratize knowledge and why now is the time to value individualized health. It's time to dive right in. Are you ready? Let's go. Flava of the week. The dominoes are falling, and the latest is the biggest one yet. The latest news heard around the world is that Walmart is closing all 51 of its healthcare clinics as well as its telehealth service. You could almost literally hear the collective gasp in your LinkedIn feed on the morning of April 30th. In a release, they said the move was a difficult decision, but they couldn't operate a profitable business because of the challenging reimbursement environment and escalating operating costs. We've seen gazillions of hot takes, of course, one of which is represented by Gabriel Perna, digital health editor at Modern Healthcare, who posted another disruptor bites the dust. Cue the healthcare is hard victory lap from the established players. Then there are reactions that reminded us of why this feels like a net loss, such as the one from Jamie Tynan, who reiterated that Walmart was providing access to healthcare in communities that needed it the most. This caused me to reflect on what attracted me to their model and vision in the first place. Before retail health was a household term, there they were, holding up a new standard of transparency, a word that seldom, if ever, had been part of the healthcare vernacular. And yet there they were, with their prices all listed on their website. And not only did you see the prices, they were low. $30 for an annual checkup for adults, $45 for a 45-minute counseling session, or as little as $25 for an adult teeth cleaning. That's one of the benefits of a patient experience that was actually designed for patients. So now, as we've had a little time to process and we're moving through our stages of grief, the longer-term questions start coming to mind. How will health systems respond? Will this have a chilling effect on their consumer innovation efforts? Will they feel less pressure of being disrupted, and will that give them more freedom to innovate? Or will it be easier to return to the status quo? Which non-traditional entrants are still even on the board now? Does the mantle of consumer-designed care rest squarely on the shoulders of One Medical now? Will direct primary care have a moment? Will someone else come in from left field? Is this the moment maybe Target has been waiting for? Hint, hint. And who will be the next casualty of the funnel wars? I know, we get it. Healthcare is hard, but after hundreds of years, we're still looking for the status quo encounter to be something that's pleasant to experience. So there's work to do. So rest in peace, Walmart Health. We barely knew ye. And yet this doesn't snuff out the flame of innovation. Lots of good things are still happening. New players are going to come in, and we'll be talking about someone else before too long. Let's collectively take a moment to acknowledge how conversations about consumer health has changed as a result of having Walmart in the healthcare business, and keep our eyes peeled for who will step up next. That's another way that we'll build the healthcare of tomorrow, and that's the Flava of the week. The flow. All right, let's get to the flow, everyone. Please give it up for Will Johnson. Will is the Vice President and General Manager of Plus Oscar, their modular solutions. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about, in general, like what the state of consumer centricity is in healthcare, specifically when we're talking about consumers who are more likely to actively manage their care. We're going to talk about enrollment in the ACA marketplace. And then we're going to talk about what digital tools will impact the future of healthcare and science and clinical practice. So a lot to cover. Let's dig right in. Will, welcome to the Healthcare Wrap.
Jared, thanks so much for having me. Excited to spend a few minutes with you all today.
Absolutely. Let's start with a little bit about who you are, what you do. Give us a couple minutes there.
Yeah, for sure. So I've been in Oscar Health now for about 8.5 years. The first roughly 7 of those were spent in our insurance business. Started in Texas to help us kind of launch that market. And then ultimately spent, most of those 7 years across three key functions. One was kind of growing our insurance business largely through Texas and the Southeast markets. Managing some of the state level P&Ls was the second component. And then also doing a lot in just the value-based space, particularly with provider partners, was in that third category. So, over those 7 years, got to see a lot of different parts of the business as we grew, and also watched a lot of fluctuations, for better, for worse, with the ACA market. I think that, now we're on a great trajectory and we're the fastest growing health insurance segment at the ACA market level, which is great. But certainly been a part of some of the ups and the downs during that time at the ACA market level. The past year plus, I moved over to our discrete technology and services business that we call Plus Oscar. I call it discrete because it is completely separate from our insurance business. We serve, of course, the insurance business in a technology capacity, but also we're leveraging the technology for other payers and other provider partners. So you can think about us as a pure kind of technology vendor that's largely taking the components that sat within the Oscar insurance and technology infrastructure or stack and moving those out to the wild into true individual businesses. So one of those businesses we call Campaign Builder. It's our engagement and automation solution that we largely use for a confluence of use cases with both provider partners and payers. But generally, we're seeing those use cases built around a few key categories. One is annual wellness visits. Another is closing gaps in care. And the third might be retention.
That's interesting about how the different parts of Oscar's business have been set up. I love that you mentioned how this is a discrete side of the business. Can you give us like a layperson's description of Oscar Health? And we'll dig into what that ultimately means for making healthcare easier for everyday people. We always like to make that connection here. But, when somebody's not familiar with Oscar Health, how do you describe it to them?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just talk about the story itself and, kind of why I joined Oscar to begin with. And I think the fundamental rationale for building the company is health insurance is not fun, easy, or an enjoyable experience oftentimes for the lay consumer. And so I think what we believed at the jump and what attracted me to the company to begin with, because frankly, I had a number of poor healthcare experiences myself where I saw this quite viscerally, is that a consumer-centric and member experience-driven approach to health insurance could ultimately lead to an engaged consumer that drives behavior change against the outcomes that you believe ultimately manifest in a quality experience for that member, and then in turn kind of P&L value for the health insurance company. So that was why Oscar started to begin with. I think it was just born out of this need for a more consumer-centric approach to health insurance and member experience. And I still think that DNA is very much still ingrained in the company. Now, as we've evolved, we're now 1.3 million members strong on the health insurance side of the business. And of course, have kind of created that separate and discrete technology business, Plus Oscar, which is taking the original technology stack that we've built and matured and commercializing components of that to others. The business is now much larger, and the evolution of that business relative to when I first joined has been a lot of fun to be a part of. But I still think that core kind of thesis or foundation remains the same. Consumer centricity is, ultimately how you drive member experience and P&L outcomes be desirable for the population to serve. And of course, the insurance businesses or providers that we work with on the technology side.
I love it. This is such an important aspect of consumer innovations that are happening. So when I do think about that, it's interesting to look over time. Listeners who have been listening to this program for more than a year or two, and this is year 6, right? So it's been interesting to see how definitions and understandings of the term consumerism have evolved during that time. A part of that does have to do with kind of the public understanding of those who do have a choice in their benefits and their insurance coverage, and those who are choosing to enroll in the ACA marketplace, for instance. That's one consumeristic side of healthcare, if you will. And it's interesting now because there's more than, the latest number I've seen is there's more than 21.3 million people enrolled in the ACA marketplace. I wonder, just from what you're seeing, what that tells us about the current state of consumer centricity in healthcare, kind of like where consumerism is today.
Yeah, I think to start, individualization has been a trend that we've seen and believed in really at the onset of the company's founding. And I think we're now seeing that continue to manifest in the larger individual market. But, even for these markets like, Medicare Advantage or even Medicaid, I think you're seeing, frankly, more kind of consumer-centric or consumer-forward approaches being deployed there. And ultimately, as those businesses both get more consumer-centric and I think, increasingly competitive from a just carrier perspective, right? If you look at the number of carriers that are offering plans in the individual market 5 years ago, it looks much, much different than it does today. I think you'll see that trend continue to accelerate. One, because I think, frankly, consumers like the products, but two, as we've seen kind of policy and regulatory tailwinds behind the individual market, both at the state level, if you think about kind of state reinsurance programs that bring down individual market premiums, or two, at the federal level, things like ICRA, which allows, I think, for this on-ramp or off-ramp, depending on how you think about the business, for employers to move their consumers into the individual market and kind of give them tax advantageous accounts to ultimately buy plans and use those. We'll continue to see, I think, the trends that have been playing out over the last couple of years play out in the future. And so I think for us, that gets us super excited on the insurance level. But if we think about that from a plus Oscar lens, a lot of our technology infrastructure was built to serve a highly consumerized or individualized market. And so as those markets get larger, I think the technology infrastructure and kind of what we're selling to payers, providers, et cetera, that want to take share in those markets becomes increasingly attractive. If you think about kind of what we were born out of, it was an individualized segment. And so as you see kind of Medicare Advantage, Medicaid, the ACA markets continue to get larger on a pure market size basis and a percentage of the country. And then you see kind of this migration from employer coverage to individual. On the plus Oscar side and Oscar insurance, I think we're just incredibly well positioned to add value to those members or partners that want to play in the spaces as well.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting because I'm sure along the way there's been a lot of segmentation involved, and you guys probably have a pretty clear picture of what types of consumers are more likely to actively manage their care. Can you describe that for us? What does that look like? What attributes are you likely to see among someone who is actively out there shopping their coverage?
I'll shift the question slightly just for the purposes of answering the question in a plus Oscar context. And the way that I would think about it is kind of less about who's doing what and more about what actions do we want members to take, both at the segment level, but also on a kind of a macro basis across the entire book. And so to me, the value that the Plus Oscar platform and Campaign Builder specifically can provide an organization, whether that's Oscar Insurance or that's, a payer partner that we're working with or a provider partner, is we can intake your membership data, et cetera, work with you on the business side, whoever that stakeholder is that we're working with, and define what actions they want at the kind of programmatic level from their entire population, and maybe more discrete actions or journeys that they want specific segments of their population to be taking. Oftentimes, I think organizations do have a good idea of like what they want from their total population in terms of AWV rates. Oscar Insurance is very focused on things like account creation and kind of digital activation. I think we're seeing that from other organizations as well. But even maybe more discreetly, some of these organizations have built like pretty robust clinical protocols for specific, chronic condition segments, et cetera. The challenge that we see oftentimes is less so what do I want members to be doing, and more so how do I get them to actually take action to enroll in those protocols and then adhere to them. And so I think on the Plus Oscar side, we can be very helpful here because we can both help to kind of automate and scale the broader kind of programmatic actions that they want to be deploying or having their members take across their entire book of business or panel, but then also help those organizations increase their enrollment and kind of key clinical or P&L value drivers across the various use cases that they've kind of drawn up. That could be, look, can I both get the member to complete the screening for diabetes or the A1C screening, but then also manage that chronic condition on a journey or longitudinal basis with true kind of digitally and data-driven interventions across that full continuum. I think oftentimes what we see is, lots of call center activity, some direct mail, and what I would call fairly analog or manually intensive processes to get members to take the right actions at the right time based on that segment that the organizations put them into or their clinical profile. And I think where we can come in and be a pretty valuable partner is to say, hey, how do we automate some of that, but also do it in a way such that the members themselves are getting communicated in a way that they're most receptive to. You can think of that as language. We have to vary the types of language that we actually use and what we send in terms of interventions, communication medium. Do folks prefer email, text, etc., and even content, right? So maybe if you're somebody that might be a little bit younger and you traditionally don't utilize primary care, and that's something that an organization really wants to drive, I think what we can say there is, hey, look, like let's put forward from a content messaging perspective a rewards-centric message, right? So it's like, hey, look, You go get this primary care visit, your insurer will pay you $50 in rewards, to complete that visit. If it's someone that frankly might come from more of a diverse or kind of multicultural background, we can play up more of the family or community driven element of primary care and that importance for their health. And so I do think we have the ability to kind of take various segments within a payer or a provider's population and kind of drive actions based on what we believe is kind of unique personas across those segments, or even down to the kind of N of one personalization level to say, for this individual, we think this is the right type of message in the right language with the right content, and even in a future state, the right time for them to be receiving it. And then finally, for those that might be, frankly, a bit more challenging to engage, we've launched and started to deploy a new technology, Applets, which is basically web-based applications that we can embed into an SMS text for members to ultimately go through a journey that they otherwise might have challenges moving through if we didn't have this technology. And I'll give you a more specific example. We find that lots of our partners have built, great websites, have vendor portals, even their own kind of member app that's oftentimes behind kind of multiple password walls or login windows. And I think, Jared, you can appreciate this. Hopefully, I don't even remember all of my logins for all the various vendors or kind of applications that I use. It would be much more advantageous and consumer centric for me to just get a text with an embedded link that takes me to the page in that application or kind of that vendor's page that leads me to the action that I need to be taking for my own health or well-being and or to satisfy kind of the P&L or business outcome needs of the organization that is ultimately accountable for my care.
That is nice because these are all steps towards personalization. And if there's too much friction along the way, then we all know, like you said, that the enrollment won't be where we want it to be. The engagement won't be where we want it to be. And so we ultimately won't see the results that we want to, if even with the technology being deployed, if there's too much friction, if it's too difficult or challenging or just too inconvenient. So I do think it's important to acknowledge the work that has to happen, the infrastructure that has to be built to make some progress here. Because when we are talking about personalization of care, one of the responsibilities, I feel like you can make the claim that there's a responsibility for healthcare organizations to democratize this knowledge and to not keep it so technical and not make it any more difficult than it needs to be, that it's actually their responsibility to democratize that knowledge. First and foremost, do you agree with that? And second off, are there any ways you're seeing that that's happening so that care can be more personalized?
Yeah, I think generally all organizations strive to take a consumer-centric, kind of transparent approach with their members. And, whether that's managing them in the context of a provider relationship or a payer, I do see a lot of consistency there. So I do think, to answer your question directly, like these organizations would love to get kind of more information and more engagement from their populations. The question is just really how you do that in a way that, yes, gets the member or the patient to complete the action that you want them to complete, but also to do so in a way that doesn't totally destroy NPS or their experience. And so I think designing eloquent journeys to make sure that the member is kind of guided through the appropriate path, regardless of, what that use case or kind of desired action is pretty critical. Because the last thing you want to do is say, okay, I need this member to complete XYZ action. Let's just go hit them with a barrage of different messages. And I'll explain some very tactical examples of that in a second. Because ultimately what happens is you might not actually even get the action completed, but even if you do, the member's just going to turn the next year. And that's not desirable for the plan. Retention, it's something that we get asked about in virtually every conversation I have with a current partner or a prospect. And it's a very critical part of, our general intervention and kind of annual engagement programming that we put forth both for Oscar Insurance, but also this Plus Oscar partners that are using the platform as well. I think some things that we see quite often, and, these come up to varying degrees in almost every conversation I have, is my population looks, much more diverse than it did 10 years ago. Regulatory changes hit me quite literally every year and have the potential to upend my P&L. And the general morbidity and just like chronic conditions of these populations that I manage also look much different than they did a decade ago. And so I think the solve for that has been this kind of proliferation of point solutions, which candidly may help at the individual use case level. But when you look at the number of people you've had to hire to solve all these various issues and onboard and utilize these point solutions that you've purchased, the coordination of those point solutions, right, as a bundle becomes quite administratively intensive. And then what you see as the net outcome is you've thrown all of these point solutions at these various problems. Very quickly, members are getting hit multiple times, if not multiples of multiples times for the same use case or variations of a use case by different departments within the broader organization that are all using these different point solution vendors. So what you find is the proliferation of point solutions, both, one, don't actually get the behavior change on an aggregate basis that you might have purchased them all for. Two, I think actually inflate your admin ratio because you're hiring people to use these tools. They require a lot of meetings to coordinate them. And then three, I'm not convinced that on aggregate, they actually lead to better NPS because what you end up having is just a barrage of messages through kind of different mediums and from different vendors or even the payer's own communications themselves that hit the member and may even cause confusion. And so I think increasingly what we're hearing is folks want a true platform that can solve various use cases across all communication mediums, whether that's, email, text, if you want to use Applet as a part of the text, you can, fax, direct mail, etc. Versus having, quite literally 10 different vendors that are solving different use cases and communication mediums for them. And I think that's where we can be quite helpful, right? You've got to get behavior change outcomes that you want or the information transfer that you want done in a way that is eloquent and NPS accretive, which ultimately we believe translates into higher retention, not the inverse. So I think that we're seeing the inverse, unfortunately, and we've become a core partner as it relates to kind of consolidating, some of those various point solutions into a true platform and being kind of a singular partner for these organizations to solve, engagement and behavior change challenges.
I absolutely agree. Just anecdotally, right? The aggregate number of point solutions, you start just saying, oh yeah, now for that one little thing, you have to go here and log in, or even if it's not that difficult of a login process, it doesn't matter. Like, yeah, there's definitely some fatigue there, I think. And so I know on the back end, kind of backstage, right? Those things happen on the stage, like where people can see it. People see, yeah, I'm having to experience a lot of friction to get this thing done that I'm being asked to do. But backstage, there are processes happening, and that's where we can leverage cool things like automation. How do health organizations leverage automation to do some of these things we were talking about and deliver value in some of these key focus areas?
I think candidly, they're all searching for automation solutions, which is where we can come in. I think for better or for worse, I think that the organizations have tried to solve these challenges via, some automation with like call center workflows, et cetera, which, of course can be quite helpful. I think that healthcare is a very challenging, nuanced, and human experience, regardless of what you're dealing with from a healthcare issue perspective. I've gone through this myself, so I have a lot of empathy for that. And sometimes you do just want to talk to a human. However, I think where we've seen real challenges from these organizations is as they grow and as they scale, you can't just put more folks in a call center conducting calls either on outbound or collect them on an inbound basis as your key solve to grow both profitably, but also preserve the member experience, ratings or outcomes that you'd like to see or that you might have saw in those earliest of days. Me personally, if somebody calls me during the day, I'm just not picking up the phone. So I think that organizations have now been forced to think a bit more digitally in nature with respect to how they build engagement strategies, but also in a way that is automated such that many of these activities are coordinated across an entire kind of value chain or member journey versus being fairly discrete and kind of one-off in nature. On the automation front, I think folks are looking oftentimes for vendors to kind of bring solutions with that embedded into their DNA. And this is particularly where I think Oscar is quite differentiated. Our goal is to almost make engagement something that the partner organization doesn't need to think about because they're kind of delegating all of that to us in the form of subject matter experts with a technology platform that's kind of been battle tested, over a decade plus, working in an individualized market with largely very tough to reach consumers. I kind of referenced this earlier, but when I first joined Oscar, our average consumer was probably the 30-year-old Brooklyn hipster, as a joke that we like to throw around. Whereas, today the average Oscar insurance consumer might be much more likely to be somebody that's 60 years old, Miami-Dade County, prefers Spanish as a first language, might be a family, and it may have multiple comorbidities. And so I think we've kind of had to build quite diverse automation solutions for this engagement challenge that we have across the various consumer profiles that we service in an increasingly kind of complex and difficult to reach community. Now that we're taking that to partners, I think they're also seeing the power of this as we engage their populations, whether it's folks that live in the Midwest and maybe more rural markets, or those frankly in South Florida that are much more reminiscent of perhaps the Oscar insurance consumer today, if you think about like the average profile.
Got it. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting to see how the areas that it has evolved and the areas where it hasn't, where there's still necessity to innovate on all sides here.
Yeah.
Which, leads me to think about kind of where things are going in the future state. It is a long-term strategy. It's a long-term. It's an ultimate transformation with a capital T, right? These are things that are going to take time. They're not simple. So it's helpful to remind us, why do you think we need to keep moving this direction? Why do you think the industry still needs to shift to become more consumer-centered and more digital? Why do you think this shift still needs to happen?
I'll tell you something that my boss and our EVP of the Plus Oscar business, Carrie Sane, and I joke about all the time. And it's that if you were to go to a conference 10 years ago and listen to the things they were talking about, particularly as it relates to consumer engagement, you kind of hear the exact same thing if you go to conferences today, which is to say we, as much as we would have liked to, I think haven't probably made as much progress as we should have over the past decade. All of the kind of digital health investment and even kind of focus, I don't know if it's led to the acceleration of the end state that we would have liked at this point. With all of that being said, we are uniquely positioned as, I think, an organization that really made this kind of the core thesis of our business, to both advance our own technology stack and products that we're bringing to the market kind of in this vector, but then also both give that to others and be true kind of subject matter experts and partners as they try to advance their capabilities, regardless of where they are on that journey. For me personally, that's been one of the most exciting parts of my current role, is being able to take a lot of the technology that I saw bring delight to our members when I was working in the Oscar insurance business, and now give that same capability to partners and get the feedback on their excitement on the outcomes that they're seeing, and also just the scalability and kind of capability unlock that the platform has provided them as they have large growth ambitions and want to continue to advance their own capabilities as an organization. Being a key partner for them through that journey has been a lot of fun. But again, I still think we've got a lot of ways to go. I literally can get retargeted for, something that I Google searched 2, 3, 4 weeks ago, on my mobile app, ads, etc., for, weeks on end. And Google has a much more unique kind of near N of one persona, maybe than any other organization in the world on me personally. But yet my payer that has literally all of my claims data and engagement history, I barely hear from. I won't get into specific payer partners, but I do think there's just a vast difference in what you would think of as kind of a consumer-centric approach, out in the broader ether than what we're seeing today in healthcare. Despite all of the data and information we have on these consumers, we just don't make good use of it. And I think that's where the Campaign Builder platform in general can be quite helpful. Yes, as a kind of on the front end intervention output machine, if you think about all the various communication mediums we use, but perhaps even more importantly on the back end is a kind of unique segmentation and persona creation engine that leverages that persona creation driven by data we get from the partners and just our own experience to drive the front end interventions and ultimately outcomes that we deliver for partners.
I appreciate the focus on partners and on the ecosystem itself. I do think that is an absolute, not only a key, but it's the only way we're going to make the progress that we ultimately need to make with pretty much every aspect of digital health. This side is so important as we do continue to recognize that consumers are getting more informed, some more than others. I wish that was equitable. I wish the same knowledge and trust was the same across the board, across the industry, across every community. I'm very aware that it's not. I'm very conscious of that. Any progress towards that is helpful. And that's why I think where all of this is taking us, being able to have these digital tools available to ultimately deliver care and engage with members along the way in ways that are more personalized, that helps people feel seen, that helps them feel that maybe certain aspects of the healthcare system actually did have them in mind as part of the care that they're seeking. So all of these things are good, they're important. And I recognize the role of digital tools in all of that. So I wonder, just in closing, if there's one message you could share out there with consumers who are having difficulty navigating the healthcare system, what message do you have for consumers who just feel like they're getting caught up in the system?
The first thing is, don't stop demanding a better system, both as an industry and as consumers, as we all are, of healthcare to varying degrees. We should continue to demand for a better experience, because I do think that demand will ultimately, over enough time and pressure, result in the industry kind of taking steps forward. But I think as an industry, we've also got to listen. I think folks have been saying a lot, that very message for decades now, and we're moving a little bit slower than we otherwise would like to. So I'd like to see that accelerate. I think from a consumer perspective, like I said, sure, like keep being loud, but I think also like you've got to seek out solutions to some of those problems through the various mediums in which you have them today. So I think, look, one of the great things that we've seen is much more accessibility, particularly for provider organizations. I think payers increasingly are getting there. I hate to say this, but sometimes you have to do your own homework as the consumer and just understand like what exactly your payer or your provider are providing you in terms of one, benefits, but two, communication mediums to get the information you need. As an organization, if you want to help accelerate that, I hope that we're, in your first 3 calls and hopefully your first one, if you're looking to solve those challenges or just get better. But I think, if I would point to one thing from consumers, I'd say just don't stop being loud and speaking up for what we need, because I think that's the only way that we're going to see acceleration and change in the industry, which has just been far too slow for my taste, sure. But frankly, I think everybody's based on what we hear, in the conference panels, et cetera, and broader ether of the industry.
What a great message to not stop demanding something better. I love that. It's a perfect place for us to wrap up. And with that, that is a wrap for this episode. It's been such a pleasure to talk about this road to personalization. I do think we're going to get to a better place. We are getting there. These actions are being taken. There's a lot of effort being put here. It's ultimately for the benefit of providing access to care and understanding what that means and having that in a delivered in a meaningful way. So with that, I want to thank you, Will. I've had the absolute pleasure of speaking with Will Johnson from Plus Oscar. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Jared. Appreciate the time.
Thanks for tuning in. If you like what you heard, please spread the word. Tell your colleagues to tune in for all the awesomeness, then leave a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. This show is produced by Shift Forward Health, the channel for changemakers. Subscribe to Shift Forward Health on your favorite podcast app, and you'll be subscribed to our entire library of shows. See our full lineup at shiftforwardhealth.com. One subscription, all the podcasts you need, and it's all for free. And remember, we might have a lot of work to do in healthcare, but we'll get there faster together. Thanks again.